They say a mother's love is the one thing in this world you can count on, the one true north, the one anchor in a storm. But for Lydia Marine, that was a story told about other people, a fairy tale from a book she was never allowed to read. Her mother's love wasn't an anchor, it was a scale, the kind you use to weigh cattle before a sale. And Lydia, well, she was always found wanting, too heavy on the scales, too light on the value. When she was 12, her dresses strained at the seams while the neighbor girls still looked like dolls. Her mother's lips would press into a thin, white line, a measurement, a judgment. When her father passed, the measuring got worse. Her mother didn't measure kindness or laughter or the way Lydia could mend a shirt so perfectly you'd never know it was torn. She measured mouths to feed and waistlines to scorn. And then came the day that broke the world in two. Lydia stood on the porch of a stranger's ranch, the dust swirling around her ankles like lost spirits. Her own mama, chin lifted, lips tight, didn't even look at her. She looked at the man on the porch, a man with eyes like evening shadows and hands like worn leather. "Take her," her mother said, the words sharp as broken glass. "She eats too much and earns too little." Just like that, in the space of a single breath, Lydia stopped being a daughter. She became a transaction, a burden to be offloaded, a sack of flour to be traded for a debt. She was an object in a world that had become too cruel for softness. But here's the thing about people who are overlooked. They see everything. While folks were busy staring at her size, at her worn-out dress and her downcast eyes, they missed the fire banked deep inside. They missed the steel in her spine. Lydia had never stopped being good. She still said thank you, even when it felt like swallowing rocks. Still patched torn shirts that weren't hers. Still sang quiet songs to herself while sweeping someone else's floor. The melody, a secret prayer for a life she didn't think she'd ever have. Because even if no one else saw her worth, she refused to unsee it herself. And she held on to that tiny, flickering flame of hope. Held on until one man finally saw it too. His name was Walter Kane, a quiet rancher who'd bought his land for a single silver dollar and a dream nobody in town could quite figure out. The townsfolk whispered about him, said he had ghosts, said he talked more to the wind-whipped trees on his property than he did to living people. He was a mystery wrapped in silence. But when he saw Lydia, standing barefoot on his porch with calloused hands and a soul that had been trampled but not broken, he didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He didn't measure her with his eyes. He just looked past the frame and saw the person inside. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "You don't owe me nothing," he said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "But if you'd like to stay, I'd be glad for the company." And that was the beginning. But it was nowhere near the whole story, because what grew between them wasn't some sudden, sweet romance. It was like a desert rain, rare, slow, almost impossible, but just enough to make wildflowers bloom where everyone else thought the ground was cursed and barren. But this isn't a story about wildflowers. It's a story about what was buried beneath them, about the ghosts that weren't just in Walter's past, but in the very soil of the earth he walked on, in the secret Lydia carried inside her, a secret even she didn't know she had, a secret her mother hadn't sold, because she had no idea it even existed, a secret that was about to get them both killed. The wagon ride to Walter Kane's ranch was 2 hours of grinding wheels and suffocating silence. The dust didn't just coat Lydia's dress, it settled in her lungs, a gritty reminder of the life she'd left behind. A life where her own mother had priced her flesh at $5 silver and a sack of flour. Less than a prize pig, more than a stray dog. Walter didn't speak a single word. He just stared ahead, his shoulders set, his jaw a hard line against the horizon. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind. He was absent. A man hollowed out by something Lydia couldn't possibly understand. His silence was a wall, and she had spent her entire life learning not to climb walls. You just learn to live in whatever small space they left for you. When they finally arrived, the sun was bleeding across the sky in angry streaks of orange and purple. The ranch was isolated, a small, sturdy cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a whole lot of nothing in every direction. It was the edge of the world, a place where secrets could be buried and nobody would ever come looking for them. Lydia expected to be shown to a shed, a cot in the corner of the barn. Instead, Walter stopped at the front door of the main cabin, stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "You eat when you're ready," he said, his voice low and flat. "There's stew on the stove." She stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was one large room, but it was clean, spotless even. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, chasing the shadows into the corners. On the small wooden table sat a bowl, a spoon, and a thick slice of bread, still warm. And near the fire, a bed, a real bed, with a thick quilt folded neatly at its foot. Lydia didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she'd lost the knack for years ago. But something inside her, a knot she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there, loosened just a fraction. That night she laid down on the soft mattress, fully expecting the knock on the door, the demand, the price for the stew and the warm bed. But no one came. There was only the sound of the wind whispering through the eaves and the steady, unfamiliar rhythm of her own calm breathing. He didn't ask her where she came from. He didn't ask what she could do. He just left the door unlocked. And that simple act of trust was more terrifying than any cruelty, because it felt like a test, and Lydia had spent her whole life failing tests. Morning came, not with a command, but with the scent of sagebrush and wood smoke. Years of habit had Lydia up before the sun, her body moving on instinct. She found a broom and began to sweep the wooden floor, the slow, rhythmic shush-shush of familiar comfort. She was a worker. That's what she was. That's what she knew how to be. Walter was already outside, tending to a pair of sturdy horses. He didn't watch her, but when he came in an hour later, he stopped just inside the door. She had made coffee, hot and black, and left a mug on the edge of the table for him. He looked at the mug, then at her. He didn't smile. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before taking it. And so began their silent dance. They settled into a rhythm that had no instructions, only instinct. Lydia patched his worn curtains with thread she found in a small sewing box. He fixed the broken latch on the back gate. She kneaded bread, the warmth seeping into her perpetually cold hands. He mended a saddle and left it by the porch without a word. Days bled into a week into two. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was watchful. She'd catch him looking at her, sometimes not with desire, but with a strange, searching intensity. Like he was looking for something, or someone. One evening she found it, tucked away in a dusty chest at the foot of her bed. She'd been looking for spare linens, but her fingers brushed against something hard, a small leather-bound book, a diary. The handwriting was delicate, looping, and feminine. It wasn't Walter's. October 12th, the first entry read, "He looks at me again today, the way he did before, as if I am a ghost in my own home. I see the question in his eyes. He is comparing, always comparing." Lydia's blood ran cold. She flipped through the pages. The entries grew more frantic, more fearful. November 3rd, he said her name in his sleep again. "Eleanor." He says it like a prayer, or a curse. Who is she? When I ask, the silence comes down like a storm. He is building a wall between us, brick by silent brick. November 20th. I found a dress in the attic. A beautiful blue one. It's too small for me. I think it was hers. I feel like I am living in someone else's life, someone else's memory. Lydia slammed the book shut, her hands trembling. This wasn't Walter's diary. It belonged to his late wife, the one the townspeople whispered had died of a fever. But this didn't sound like a woman dying of a fever. This sounded like a woman being driven mad. Later that evening, as Walter sat across from her, cleaning a rifle, his movements slow and methodical, she looked at him, really looked at him, at the hard lines of his face, the shadows in his eyes, the quiet, powerful set of his hands. He said her name, Eleanor. And Lydia realized with a sickening lurch that he wasn't just a quiet man. He was a haunted one, and she was sleeping in a dead woman's bed. The silence of the cabin suddenly felt different, heavier. It wasn't just the absence of words anymore. It was the presence of secrets. Lydia could feel them in the floorboards, in the way the firelight flickered and danced, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. She looked at Walter, his head bent over the rifle, his focus absolute, and a new kind of fear took root in her heart. It wasn't the familiar fear of being unwanted or cast aside. This was something colder, primal. She was alone out here, miles from anyone, with a man who slept with ghosts, a man whose first wife wrote about him like he was a stranger, a jailer. Lydia started watching him, not just observing their silent routine, but studying him. She noticed the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the far corner of the room, as if watching someone she couldn't see. She saw how he never ever opened the door to the small pantry at the back of the cabin. It was always locked, bolted from the outside. Why would you bolt a pantry from the outside? One afternoon, when he was out mending a fence line on the far side of the property, she decided to find out. Her hands shook as she examined the heavy iron bolt. It was old, rusted shut. It took a pry bar from the tool shed and all of her strength to force it open. The screech of metal on metal was deafening in the quiet house. The door swung inward into blackness. A wave of musty, cold air washed over her. It smelled of dust and decay and something else, something faintly sweet, like dried flowers. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom. It wasn't a pantry, it was a room, a small windowless room. In the center, covered by a white sheet, was a shape. It was the size of a person. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the cabin, out of this place, and never look back. But she couldn't. She had to know. With a trembling hand, she reached out and pulled back the sheet. It wasn't a body. It was a painting, a life-size portrait of a woman. She was beautiful, with fiery red hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. She wore a simple blue dress, and she looked happy, radiant. But that wasn't what made Lydia gasp and stumble backward. Around the woman's neck, painted in exquisite, horrifying detail, was a necklace of bruises, dark, ugly fingerprints blooming on her pale skin. And at the bottom of the canvas, almost hidden in the shadows, was a signature. W. Kane. Walter. He hadn't just owned the painting. He had painted it. He had painted his beautiful wife, Eleanor, with the marks of violence on her throat. This wasn't a memorial. It was a confession, or a trophy. Lydia felt sick. The stew she'd eaten for lunch churned in her stomach. The diary, the locked room, the painting, it all clicked into place, forming a picture so monstrous she could barely comprehend it. The fever hadn't killed Eleanor. Walter had. She backed out of the room, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She had to leave. Now. She couldn't stay another night under this roof. She turned to run, to grab the few things she owned and just disappear into the wilderness. But when she turned, he was standing there, right in the cabin doorway, blocking the only exit. He wasn't holding a rifle. He wasn't angry. His face was a mask of profound, soul-deep sadness. He looked from her terrified face to the open door of the secret room, and a sound escaped his throat. A raw, broken sound, like an animal caught in a trap. "You weren't supposed to see that," he whispered, his voice cracking. Lydia stood frozen, trapped between the man who had shown her the first kindness she had ever known, and the monster who had painted his dead wife with bruises around her neck. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror. The cabin, once a haven, was now a cage. Walter, once a silent protector, was now her captor. Who was she? Lydia finally managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. Walter's eyes, the color of dusk, seemed to darken further. He didn't look at her. He looked at the painting in the dark room, at the ghost he kept under lock and key. "She was my wife," he said. "Eleanor." He said the name just like the diary described. A prayer and a curse all at once. "The fever," Lydia began, her voice trembling. "There was no fever," Walter said, his voice flat, dead. He finally met her gaze, and what she saw there wasn't malice. It was an agony so profound it stole her breath. "I told the town it was a fever. It was easier than the truth." Lydia's mind raced. This was it. The moment he confessed. The moment he would silence her. just like he silenced Eleanor. Her body tensed, ready to fight, to scream, to do anything to survive. "What is the truth, Walter?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He took a step forward and she flinched back. He stopped immediately, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "The truth," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "is that I failed her. I couldn't protect her." This wasn't the confession she expected. Her confusion warred with her fear. Protect her from what? "From him," Walter said, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists. "From the man who did that to her." He gestured toward the painting. "The man who owns this whole valley. The man who owns the town. The sheriff. Everything. The man who put those marks on her neck and left her for dead because she wouldn't be his." A new name entered the story. A new shadow fell across the room. "Who?" Lydia pressed. "His name is Silas Croft," Walter said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "And he's the reason I'm out here. The reason I don't talk to anyone. I'm not hiding from my ghosts, Lydia. I'm waiting. I painted that. I painted that to remember, to make sure I never forgot what he did, to fuel the hate that keeps me breathing." Suddenly the narrative flipped. The monster became a victim. The silence wasn't guilt. It was grief. The isolation wasn't madness. It was a self-imposed exile. A waiting game. "But why?" Lydia asked, her mind struggling to keep up. "Why did you bring me here? Why me?" Walter finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the raw, desperate hope beneath his pain. "Because your mother," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is in debt, deep in debt, to one man. Silas Croft." The floor seemed to drop out from under Lydia. Her mother, the sale, the $5 silver. It wasn't just about getting rid of a burden. It was a payment, a down payment. "Silas Croft saw you in town once, months ago with your mother," Walter continued, his voice urgent. "He told her he wanted you. He likes collecting things, people. He told your mother he would forgive her debts in exchange for you. She was supposed to deliver you to him last week." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. She wasn't sold to Walter. She was saved by him. He had intercepted the transaction. He had paid her mother off just to get to her first. "I brought you here to keep you safe," he said, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "To hide you from him. But I didn't know how to tell you. How could I explain that the only way to save you from one monster was to bring you to the home of another?" He thought of himself as a monster, a man consumed by vengeance. Before Lydia could process this earth-shattering revelation, a sound cut through the air. The distinct sound of horses. Not one horse, but several. And they were approaching the cabin. Fast. Walter's head snapped toward the window, his entire body going rigid. The look on his face wasn't grief anymore. It was the cold, hard mask of a man preparing for war. "He found us," Walter breathed. "Silas is here." And Lydia realized the truth. She hadn't been brought to a cage. She had been brought to a battlefield, and the battle was just about to begin. The thundering of hooves grew closer, a drumbeat of impending doom. Walter moved with a speed that startled Lydia. The grieving, quiet man vanished, replaced by a soldier. He grabbed the rifle he'd been cleaning, his movements economical and deadly. "Get in the root cellar," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "The entrance is under the rug by the hearth. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Lydia was frozen for a second, her mind reeling. Silas Croft. The name hung in the air like smoke. The faceless villain who had murdered Walter's wife and now wanted her. Her mother hadn't just sold her. She'd sold her to a killer. "Go! Now!" Walter's voice was sharp, cutting through her paralysis. She scrambled to the hearth, her hands fumbling with the thick bearskin rug. Underneath was a heavy wooden trapdoor with an iron ring. She pulled with all her might, the door groaning in protest before lifting. A wave of cool, earthy air rushed up to meet her. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled down the rickety ladder into the darkness below, pulling the heavy door shut over her head. Plunged into absolute blackness, her other senses took over. She could hear the creak of the floorboards above her as Walter moved into position. She could hear the jingle of harnesses and the snorting of horses as they surrounded the cabin. Then a voice, a man's voice, smooth and cultured, but with an undercurrent of pure menace that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Walter Caney, I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me. Send her out, and I might just let you live out your miserable days on this pathetic patch of dirt." It was Silas Croft. Lydia held her breath, pressing her ear against the wooden door above. She heard Walter's muffled reply, too low to make out the words, but the tone was defiant. "A shame." Croft's voice dripped with false regret. "I do so hate to be uncivilized." The world exploded. The sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the cabin, followed by the splintering of wood. Then another, and another. The cabin floor above her vibrated with the impact of bodies hitting it. Shouts, curses, the sickening, wet thud of fists meeting flesh. It was a symphony of violence, and Lydia was trapped right underneath the orchestra. She crouched in the dark, her hands over her mouth to stifle her own screams. She was the cause of this. This quiet, gentle man was fighting and possibly dying. For her. A woman he barely knew. A woman who had been thrown away by her own family. The fighting seemed to go on for an eternity. The sounds were brutal, terrifying. Then there was a loud crash, as if the heavy dining table had been overturned. It was followed by a single final gunshot that was deafeningly loud, right above her head. And then, silence. A dead, ringing silence that was somehow more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. Was it over? Who had won? Was Walter dead? Was Silas Croft now going to tear the cabin apart looking for his prize? Her mind conjured images of the trapdoor being ripped open, of that smooth, cruel voice calling down to her in the dark. She waited. 1 second. 10. A minute. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. She couldn't stay down here forever. She had to know. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed upward on the trapdoor. It didn't move. Something heavy was on top of it. Panic flared in her chest. She was trapped, buried alive. She pushed again, with all her strength, her shoulders screaming in protest. The door lifted a fraction of an inch, and a sliver of light cut through the darkness. She pressed her eye to the crack. She could see a sliver of the cabin floor. It was slick with something dark, and lying directly on top of the trapdoor was a body, a man in a dusty waistcoat, his eyes open and lifeless. One of Croft's men. With a surge of adrenaline, Lydia gave one last, desperate shove. The body on the door shifted just enough for her to squeeze the door open and scramble out. The cabin was destroyed. Furniture was splintered, windows were shattered, and the walls were riddled with bullet holes. 3 of Croft's men lay dead on the floor, but there was no sign of Croft himself, or Walter. Then she saw it. The front door was wide open, and leading away from it was a trail of blood. 2 trails, in fact. One was heavy, dragging. The other was a set of deep, determined boot prints. Walter hadn't won. He had lost. Croft had taken him. Lydia stood in the ruins of the cabin, the silence pressing in on her. The world had once again been ripped out from under her. She was alone. Truly alone this time. She could run. No one would blame her. She could disappear, find a new town, a new name, and spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as she looked at the carnage, at the evidence of the fight Walter had put up for her, something inside her shifted. For her entire life she had been passive, a victim of circumstance, a thing to be measured, judged, and sold. Walter Kane was the first person who had ever treated her like a human being worth protecting. He had fought for her. He had bled for her. She looked down at her own hands. Calloused, yes, but strong. She looked at her reflection in a shard of broken mirror. Her face was plain, her body was large. But her eyes held a fire that had been banked for too long. Silas Croft thought he was hunting a prize. He thought he had captured the night. He had no idea about the Queen. Lydia walked over to the wall where Walter kept his spare ammunition. She picked up a box of shells, Then she walked to the corner and picked up the rifle that had been dropped by one of Croft's dead men. It was heavy in her hands, unfamiliar, but it felt right. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was going hunting. She followed the trail of blood and boot prints. The path led away from the ranch, toward the jagged, rocky hills that bordered Walter's land. Croft was arrogant. He wasn't trying to hide his tracks. He was dragging his prize home. Lydia's heart pounded with a cold, focused rage. Every drop of Walter's blood on the dusty ground was a spark on the kindling of her fury. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the landscape. She had to move fast. She was not a natural tracker, but the path was sickeningly clear. Scuff marks in the dirt showed where Walter had struggled, where Croft or his remaining men had dragged him onward. As she rounded a large rock formation, she saw it, a small, hidden canyon, and nestled within it, a sprawling, opulent ranch house that seemed grotesquely out of place in the rugged wilderness. It was a fortress, Silas Croft's fortress. Lights were beginning to glow in the windows. She couldn't just walk in the front door. She was one woman, with one rifle she barely knew how to use, against who knew how many men. She needed a plan. She needed an advantage. She remembered the diary, Eleanor's diary. Lydia had read it so many times in the dark, quiet nights at the cabin that she had practically memorized it. Eleanor had written about Croft, about his obsession with her, about the times he had brought her to his ranch, trying to woo her before he turned violent. She had described the house. He thinks his walls are impenetrable, one entry read, but he forgets about the water, the old smuggler's tunnels that run from the creek bed right into the wine cellar. He showed them to me once, bragging about his cleverness. His pride will be his undoing. The creek bed. Lydia scanned the landscape. There, not 50 yards from the main house, was a dry, rocky creek. It was her only chance. She scrambled down the embankment, staying low, using the deepening twilight as cover. Her dress snagged on thorns and sharp rocks bit at her ankles, but she didn't feel the pain. All she felt was a single, burning purpose. Get Walter back. She found the entrance to the tunnel exactly where Eleanor's diary had hinted it would be, hidden behind a curtain of overgrown ivy. The air inside was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and secrets. She lit a match she found in her pocket, the tiny flame pushing back the oppressive darkness. The tunnel was narrow, claustrophobic. Water dripped from the ceiling, and unseen things scurried away from the light. But she pushed forward, Eleanor's words her map, her courage a shield. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel ended at a thick, wooden door, a wine cellar. She could hear voices from the other side, muffled but clear enough. He's losing a lot of blood. Boss ain't gonna be happy if his new pet's protector dies before he's had his fun with him. Just tie him up. The boss wants the woman. He's probably halfway to Mexico by now. Lydia's blood ran cold. They thought she had run. Good. That was her advantage. She took a deep breath, extinguished her match, and lifted the heavy iron latch on the door as quietly as she possibly could. It opened into a massive, stone-walled cellar, lined with racks of wine. Two of Croft's men were at the far end, tying a slumped and bleeding Walter to a wooden support beam. Walter was alive. That was all that mattered. The men had their backs to her. She raised the rifle, her hands surprisingly steady. She was not a killer. She had never harmed a living soul in her life. But these men were part of the evil that had taken Eleanor, the evil that was about to destroy Walter. They were not men. They were obstacles. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed for a massive wine cask perched precariously on a high shelf right above their heads. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet splintered the wood of the shelf. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting timber, the massive cask tipped forward and crashed to the stone floor. It shattered like a bomb, sending a tidal wave of dark red wine and splintered oak across the cellar. The two men yelled in shock, knocked off their feet by the force of the deluge. They were soaked, disoriented, their pistols washed from their hands. That was all the time Lydia needed. She charged out of the shadows, grabbing a heavy, discarded wine bottle from a rack. She brought it down with all her strength on the head of the first man as he struggled to his feet. He crumpled without a sound. The second man turned, his eyes wide with disbelief, and she swung again, a guttural roar tearing from her own throat. He went down just as hard. Silence. The only sound was the dripping of wine and her own ragged breathing. She rushed to Walter's side. He was conscious, but barely. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his shirt soaked with blood from a wound in his side. "Lydia!" he rasped, his eyes struggling to focus. "You came back." "I told you," she said, her voice choked with emotion as her fingers worked frantically at the ropes on his wrists. "You'd be glad for the company." The ropes fell away. She helped him to his feet, draping his arm over her shoulders, taking his weight. He was heavy, but she was strong. All those years of being told her body was a burden, right now its strength was a blessing. "We have to get out of here," she urged, pulling him toward the tunnel. "Too late," a calm voice said from the top of the cellar stairs. Lydia's head snapped up. Standing there, silhouetted by the light from the house, was a man. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. He was handsome, with a charming smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. In his hand, he held a small, elegant-looking pistol, aimed directly at them. Silas Croft. "Well, well," Silas said, his smile widening. "It seems the little mouse has claws. I am impressed, truly. It will make breaking you all the more satisfying. Drop the rancher, my dear. He served his purpose. Now it's your turn." Lydia stood her ground, Walter's dead weight leaning against her. Her mind raced. The tunnel was behind her, but they'd be shot before they took 2 steps. There was no escape. They were trapped. "I said drop him," Croft repeated, his voice losing its charming edge, replaced by cold command. Walter stirred beside her. "Lydia!" "Run," he breathed. But Lydia wasn't looking at Croft anymore. Her eyes were darting around the cellar, searching, desperate. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. His pride will be his undoing. He bragged about his cleverness. He had shown her the tunnels. What else had he shown her? What other secrets did this cellar hold? Her gaze fell upon the intricate network of pipes running along the ceiling, old gas lines for the lamps in the house above, and on the wall right beside the staircase where Croft stood was a series of brass wheels, control valves. Old Dusty probably hadn't been touched in years. She had an idea, a wild, insane, suicidal idea, but it was the only one she had. She looked at Walter, her eyes conveying a message she hoped he'd understand. Then she looked back up at Silas Croft, and for the first time in her life, she smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. "You're right," she said, her voice clear and steady. She gently lowered Walter to the floor, propping him up against the wall. "He's just dead weight." Croft's smug expression intensified. He had won. He started to descend the stairs, his pistol still trained on her. "A wise decision. You're much more intelligent than your mother gave you credit for." "Oh, I'm full of surprises," Lydia said, and with the speed of a striking snake, she lunged, not at Croft, but at the wall of wine racks next to her. She grabbed a bottle, spun, and hurled it with all her might, not at Croft, but at the old, ornate gas lamp hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the room. The bottle shattered against the lamp. The glass chimney broke, and the flame inside sputtered, exposed. At the exact same moment, Croft realized what she was doing. He raised his pistol to fire, but he was too late. Lydia was already scrambling across the floor, her hands reaching for the large brass wheel on the wall, the main valve for the gas lines. She gave it a desperate two-handed twist. The old valve groaned in protest, then broke free with a rusty squeal. A loud hissing sound filled the cellar, the unmistakable smell of gas. Croft's eyes went wide with horror. He was standing on the stairs, halfway between the now leaking gas lines and the open flame of the broken lamp. The cellar had just become a giant, stone-walled bomb, and he was standing right in the middle of it. He had a choice: shoot her and die in the explosion, or run for his life. Pride, it turned out, was no match for self-preservation. With a curse that was swallowed by the hissing gas, Croft turned and fled back up the stairs. "Walter!" Lydia screamed, rushing back to him. The tunnel! Now! She hauled him to his feet, practically dragging him into the darkness of the smuggler's tunnel. They stumbled through the blackness, the hissing sound from the cellar growing fainter behind them. They were 20 feet in, 30, 40. Then the world turned white. A deafening roar ripped through the earth, the shock wave throwing them violently against the tunnel wall. The ground shook, and rocks and dirt rained down from the ceiling. The tunnel behind them collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris, sealing them in. They were alive, trapped in the darkness, but alive. Lydia lay on the damp earth, her ears ringing, her body bruised, with the unconscious form of Walter Kane beside her. She had done it. She had faced the monster and won. She had saved the man who saved her. But as she lay there in the suffocating blackness, a new chilling thought crept into her mind. The tunnel entrance was now buried under tons of rock. There was no going back. And Eleanor's diary had never mentioned another way out. They had escaped the fire, only to be buried alive in a tomb of their own making. The darkness in the tunnel was absolute. It was a physical presence, pressing in on Lydia, thick and suffocating. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and exploded rock. Walter was still unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. She checked his pulse. It was weak, thready, but it was there. They were alive. For now. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat. The entrance was gone, buried. Eleanor's diary, their only map, had led them this far, but it offered no way forward. Had she saved them from Croft only to lead them to a slow, lingering death in the dark? No, she refused to accept that. She had not come this far. She had not fought this hard, just to give up. There had to be another way. Eleanor was smart. Walter had said Croft was arrogant. He wouldn't have built a trap with only one way in. There had to be an escape route. Lydia's hands started exploring the rough-hewn walls of the tunnel, feeling her way deeper into the earth. It was their only option, to go forward. One hand on the wall, the other gripping Walter's collar, she began to drag him deeper into the blackness. Every foot was a monumental effort. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned. After what could have been minutes or hours, her searching fingers found something. A change in the texture of the wall. Not rough stone, but smooth, dressed wood. A door. Her heart leaped. She fumbled in the dark, her hands searching for a latch, a handle, anything. She found a small, recessed iron ring. She pulled. The door was swollen with damp, stuck fast in its frame. She threw her entire weight against it, again and again, a desperate rhythmic slamming. It groaned, it splintered, but it wouldn't give. "Walter," she gasped, shaking him. "Walter, wake up. I need you." He stirred, groaning. "Lydia, what happened?" "Croft is gone. The house, it's gone. But we're trapped. There's a door, but I can't open it." He tried to push himself up, but fell back with a pained gasp. "My side. I know, she soothed, but I need your help. Just for a second." Together, leaning on each other, they put their combined weight against the door. Once, twice. On the third try, there was a loud crack, and the door flew inward, sending them sprawling into another smaller chamber. This one wasn't dark. A faint, silvery light filtered down from a grate in the ceiling high above. It was an old storm cellar, long abandoned, and on the far wall was a set of crumbling stone steps, leading up, leading out. They had found it, a way out. They emerged into the cool night air, gasping like newborns. The storm cellar opened up in a thicket of trees a good 100 yards from the smoldering crater where Silas Croft's mansion used to be. The night was quiet, the stars brilliant overhead. They were free. They stumbled back to Walter's ranch, a slow, agonizing journey. Lydia practically carried him the last mile. She cleaned and dressed his wound as best she could, using strips of her own dress for bandages. He had lost a lot of blood, but the bullet had gone clean through his side. He would live. They collapsed into their respective beds, exhaustion pulling them down into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Lydia woke to the smell of coffee. She sat up, her body aching in places she didn't know existed. Walter was standing by the stove, pale and moving stiffly, but he was on his feet. He had made coffee. He poured her a cup and brought it to her, his hand brushing hers as she took it. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't watchful or haunted. It was peaceful. Shared. "You saved my life," he said, his voice quiet. "You saved mine first," she replied. They didn't need to say anything else. They had faced death together. They had walked through fire and darkness. Words were no longer necessary. But the story wasn't over. Not quite. A few days later, as Walter was recovering, the town sheriff rode up to the cabin. A portly, officious man named Biddle, who had always looked at Walter with suspicion. Lydia's hand immediately went to the rifle resting by the door. "Caney," Biddle said, not dismounting, "folks are saying there was some kind of explosion up at the Croft place. The whole damn thing's gone. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" His eyes were narrow, accusatory. He was Croft's man, through and through. Walter stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Lydia. "Can't say that I do, Sheriff. Been right here, recovering from a hunting accident." Biddle sneered. "Is that right? Funny. Silas Croft has disappeared, and a local woman, one of his business associates," he said the words with a nasty emphasis, "filed a complaint this morning. Said her daughter was abducted. By you." He was talking about her mother, of course, trying to spin the story to make Walter the villain. "You're to come with me, Caney. We're going to have a long talk." Biddle's hand rested on the butt of his pistol, but before Walter could respond, Lydia stepped out from behind him. She was no longer the downcast, silent woman who had arrived weeks ago. Her chin was high, her eyes clear and direct. "He didn't abduct me, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I came here by choice." "Is that so?" Biddle scoffed. "Your mother has a signed document that says otherwise. A bill of sale. According to the law, you're her property, and she sold your contract to Mr. Croft." "Then my mother is a liar," Lydia said calmly. She took a step forward. "And Silas Croft was a murderer. He killed Walter's wife, Eleanor, years ago. He assaulted her, and when Walter came for justice, Croft used his power to have it covered up, calling it a fever. He was a monster who used his money and influence to prey on people. And whatever happened at his ranch the other night," she looked the sheriff dead in the eye, "it was justice. Long overdue." The sheriff was stunned into silence. He hadn't expected her to speak. He certainly hadn't expected her to fight back with the truth. That's a wild accusation," he stammered. "Is it?" asked a new voice. They all turned. Riding up the path was the town doctor, a kind elderly man named Doc Evans, and beside him were two other men, ranchers from the valley. "I was the one who signed Eleanor Kane's death certificate," Doc Evans said, his old eyes sad but resolute. "And Silas Croft stood over my shoulder the entire time, telling me what to write. I've lived with that shame for years, but no more." The other ranchers nodded in agreement. "We all knew what Croft was," one of them said. "We were just too scared to do anything about it, but we ain't scared anymore." Sheriff Biddle looked from the doctor, to the ranchers, to the hard, unwavering gaze of Lydia Marine. He saw his power, Croft's power, evaporating in the morning sun. He was a snake without a head, defeated. With a pathetic, sputtering noise, he turned his horse and galloped away, back to the town that no longer belonged to him. Lydia stood on the porch watching him go. She had not only saved herself and Walter, she had liberated an entire valley from the grip of a tyrant. She had done it not with brute force, but with something far more powerful, the truth. Walter came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the warmth of him, the strength. He looked at her, not with gratitude, but with something deeper. Awe. "I went looking for revenge," he said softly, "but I found grace instead." The days that followed were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, a healing quiet. The townsfolk, freed from Croft's shadow, started visiting. They brought pies and fresh vegetables. They offered to help mend the barn. They treated Walter not as an outcast, but as a man who had borne an impossible burden. And they looked at Lydia with a kind of reverence. They didn't see her size or her plain dress. They saw the woman who had faced down Silas Croft, the woman who had spoken the truth when everyone else was silent. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in the same colors as the day she arrived, Lydia found Walter on the porch. He was carving something into the thick wooden beam above the door with his pocket knife. She watched him for a moment, then stepped closer to see the word he was carefully etching into the wood. It was one single word, ours, not his, not hers, but theirs. A home they had forged together in fire and blood and silence. He finished the last letter, then turned to her. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have any flowery words. He just looked at her, his heart in his eyes. And Lydia, who had spent a lifetime feeling like she was too much, too heavy, too difficult to love, simply said, yes. They were married under an old oak tree the following spring. It wasn't a fancy affair, just them, Doc Evans, and a few of the neighboring ranchers. But for Lydia, it was more perfect than any fairy tale. Years passed. The ranch thrived. Laughter filled the small cabin, which they slowly expanded room by room. Lydia planted a garden, and bright, defiant sunflowers grew tall and strong, turning their faces to the sun. She was no longer a shadow. She was a force of nature. She hadn't been saved. She had bloomed because someone had been brave enough to give her a place to plant her roots, and she had been strong enough to break through the rocky soil all on her own. Sometimes strangers passing through would hear the story of the quiet rancher and his formidable wife. They'd hear the whispers about the ghost of Silas Croft and the night his empire turned to ash. And they'd look at Lydia, this calm, smiling woman with gentle hands and eyes that held the wisdom of a survivor. And they'd ask her how she did it, how she endured so much and came out the other side. Lydia would just smile that soft, secret smile of hers and say, "He saw me. That's all. That's everything." There are people in this world who spend their entire lives just wishing for one simple thing, to be truly seen. Not for what they look like or where they come from, but for the quiet strength they carry inside. Lydia was one of those people, and her story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most unlikely person can change your world. Not by saving you, but by simply standing beside you while you save yourself. Have you ever felt overlooked like Lydia? Or have you found unexpected strength in a place where you thought there was none? We all have a story of a time we had to fight for our own worth. If this story moved you, and you want to hear more tales of hidden strength and unexpected justice, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We read all of your comments, and your stories inspire us to find more just like this one. Thank you for being part of our community, and may you always find someone who sees you and a home that you can call yours.